Black Conservative Continuum by George P. Brooks. There is a lie that has been told so often it now masquerades as moral law, that blackness has a political home and that home is progressive liberalism. Question that assumption and you are not merely disagreed with, you are exiled, called confused, called dangerous, called a traitor to your people. That reaction alone should tell us something is deeply wrong. The Black Conservative Continuum is not an argument for party loyalty. It is not a plea for Republican validation. It is not nostalgia, respectability politics, or proximity to whiteness. It's a philosophical excavation, a reckoning with history, incentives, culture, power, and responsibility. It is an insistence that Black thought is not monolithic, that Black dignity does not require ideological obedience, and that Black survival depends on truth more than comfort. This continuum begins with a simple but forbidden premise. Black people are not children, and we do not need permanent political guardianship, the myth of the political savior. For over half a century, the Democratic Party has positioned itself as the protector of Black America. This narrative is reinforced through selective history, emotional symbolism, and the strategic weaponization of fear. Republicans are framed as existential threats, Democrats as flawed but necessary allies. The result is a closed system where outcomes matter less than intentions, and loyalty is demanded regardless of results. But here is the uncomfortable question the continuum forces us to ask. If protection is the promise, why are the protected still bleeding? Generations of Black Americans have lived under Democratic dominance in major cities: Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, Oakland. These cities are not conservative experiments. They are progressive strongholds. And yet they suffer from entrenched poverty, failing schools, violent crime, broken infrastructure, and political corruption that would be intolerable in any other community. The response is always the same. It would be worse under Republicans. This is not an argument. It is a threat, and threats are what used when you cannot defend outcomes. The continuum rejects the politics of fear. It demands accountability. It insists that intentions do not outweigh consequences, and that moral posturing is not a substitute for results. From civil rights to permanent dependence. The civil rights movement was a moral revolution rooted in universal principles: equality before the law, individual dignity, and freedom from state-sanctioned discrimination. Those principles were not progressive inventions. They were conservative at their core. They appealed to natural rights, constitutional integrity, and moral responsibility. Somewhere along the way, that vision was replaced. What began as a demand for equal footing transformed into a system of managed dependency. Welfare expansion replaced family stability, bureaucracy replaced community leadership, victimhood replaced agency, and dissent became heresy. This was not accidental. Political power thrives on dependency. A population that believes it cannot survive without the state will never challenge the state. And so policies were crafted not to elevate, but to entrench, to create reliable voting blocks rather than resilient citizens. The Black Conservative Continuum recognizes this shift as a betrayal, not a progression. It argues that you cannot liberate a people by convincing them they are permanently broken. The erosion of the Black family. No conversation about Black outcomes can be honest without confronting the collapse of the Black family. This is where the continuum becomes truly radioactive, because it refuses to outsource responsibility entirely to racism while still acknowledging its historical weight. Before the Great Society programs, Black marriage rates were higher than white marriage rates. Two-parent households were the norm, not the exception. Despite segregation, despite a discrimination, despite limited access to capital, Black families maintained cohesion. After decades of well-intentioned but disastrous policy, the incentives changed. Fatherhood was economically penalized. Marriage was bureaucratically discouraged. Dependency was rewarded. Responsibility became optional. Today, the consequences are undeniable. Higher incarceration rates, lower educational attainment, increased behavioral issues, and generational trauma compounded by absence. The continuum does not moralize. It contextualizes. It argues that culture responds to incentives, and when the state replaces the father, the result is not compassion. It is chaos. Education, indoctrination over instruction. Education was once the great equalizer. Today, in many Black communities, it has become an ideological factory. Public schools in urban districts fail academically while excelling at political messaging. Students graduate fluent in grievance but illiterate in math. They are taught to see themselves as oppressed subjects rather than capable individuals. Excellence is framed as conformity to ideology rather than mastery of skill. School choice, charters, vouchers, homeschooling has been one of the most effective tools for disrupting this cycle, and yet it's viciously opposed by the same political actors who claim to care most about black children. Why? Because education is power, and power that escapes centralized control threatens the narrative. The Continuum supports educational freedom not because it is conservative branding, but because parents know their children better than bureaucrats, and competition produces excellence where monopolies produce decay, crime, compassion, and consequences. The progressive approach to crime is rooted in abstraction. Crime is always contextualized, rarely confronted. Victims are statistical footnotes. Perpetrators are humanized to the point of absolution. The result is predictable. Lawlessness becomes normalized, communities become unsafe, and the most vulnerable suffer the most. Black Americans are disproportionately victims of violent crime. This is not because of over-policing, it is because of underprotection. When police retreat, gangs advance. When laws soften, predators adapt. The Continuum rejects the false binary between compassion and accountability. It insists that order is not oppression, that safety is a civil right, and that no community thrives when violence is excused as social commentary, identity politics as psychological warfare. Perhaps the most corrosive element of modern progressivism is its obsession with identity. Race, gender, sexuality, these categories are no longer descriptors. They are currencies. Blackness is no longer something to be lived, it is something to be performed. Deviation from approved narratives is punished. Independent thought is labeled betrayal, and the individual is sacrificed at the altar of group grievance. The Continuum exposes this as psychological warfare. A population trained to see itself primarily as oppressed will never see itself as powerful. A mind constantly focused on historical wounds cannot build future structures. This does not mean ignoring racism. It means refusing to let it define the limits of possibility. Conservatism as resistance, not assimilation. Black conservatism is often caricatured as assimilationist, as an attempt to gain approval from white institutions. This is projection. In reality, black conservatism is resistance. Resistance to ideological colonization, resistance to lowered expectations, resistance to the soft bigotry of benevolent neglect. It draws from faith, self-discipline, entrepreneurship, and community accountability. It values tradition not because it is old, but because it has survived. It prioritizes responsibility not as punishment, but as empowerment. For the black conservative, freedom is not the absence of constraint, it is the mastery of self. Fatherhood, faith, and moral infrastructure. As a father, I understand that ideology collapses under the weight of responsibility. You cannot theorize your way out of feeding your children. You cannot protest your way into discipline. You must act. Faith, particularly Christianity, has been one of the most stabilizing forces in Black history. It provided moral infrastructure when political institutions failed. It cultivated resilience, forgiveness, and purpose. The modern progressive project seeks to hollow out this foundation, replacing transcendence with politics and community with activism. The result is a spiritual vacuum filled with rage. The Continuum argues that a society without moral anchors drifts toward nihilism and that no amount of policy can replace character. The price of dissent. To be a black conservative is to pay a social tax. You are questioned by strangers, distanced by peers, and dismissed by institutions. But that cost is the price of integrity. The Continuum does not ask for permission. It does not seek validation. It exists because silence has become complicity, and comfort has become a cage. History remembers those who spoke when it was easier not to. Conclusion, beyond left and right. The Black conservative continuum is not about choosing sides. It is about rejecting false choices. It is about reclaiming agency in a system that profits from dependency. It is about telling uncomfortable truths in a culture addicted to soothing lies. Black Americans do not need saviors. We need space to think, freedom to fail, and the dignity to rise on our own terms. The future will not be built by those who shout the loudest about injustice, but by those willing to confront reality without flinching. And reality, however unforgiving, is still the only solid ground on which freedom has ever stood. Stay blessed.